control of it.
Okay, we're going to resume. We're back webcasting. I just took a moment at the lunch hour just to draw our attention to the kinds of questions that we were asking. So we've gone through questions around claims research and claims resolution. We've touched on funding in and out. But I want to make sure that we've had time to talk about claim adjudication.
or specific, because First Nations are sometime where Canada is going to say, or the province, no, enough is enough, like, we can't recognize any more lands. Yes, you have to go through fee simple because of that thing that legal jargon, abrogate, derogate, and will not, or whatever, on treating Aboriginal rights and title. And then, like Rose said, you have to surrender and give up that right that you haven't really negotiated yet for the future. Is that what it means, or is it specific to that? Then you have no more claims thereafter. So, like, collectively taking that research and making it more accessible, like you're saying, like the RG10 documents, when we went to a privacy meeting last year, the privacy commissioner from Canada saying that it's all going to be digitized, but you're still limited when you're in negotiations at the federal level. No, you can't have it First Nation because we're in courts right now. So it's up to you to go to hell and do your own research. And so it's not a, so those were the benefits of those really good researchers to collectively gather that and put that claim forward.
So should an independent body be able to carry out its own research then too?
If it has access to information, it would, as you would have that idea of, say, we missed something, then, okay, this could be, because from our experience, those types of discussions, it's similar to what elders are saying, right? If you don't have that background information that you missed something, then it should be included, and not, because it's still part of that, like you said, it's not dismantling, but there's another element of, okay, we missed this. What other information could we add on, whether it's oral history or missed data based on how Canada might have miscategorized or misplaced in a ABC First Nation into Z. And then it's through the whole process you find out we missed Z because it was misfiled or things like that. There was a purpose and just a mistake sometimes in how data is
Accessed. Paula, you used the acronym OCAP. Ownership, control, access.
And possession. That's First Nations, oh my God, just give me a second. It's a institution in Ontario.
As a way to protect information integrity, authenticity at the community level.
Yeah, it's called First Nations Information Governance Center. Has come up with what's called the First Nations Principles of OCAP.
What do you think about Canada, representatives of Canada, being involved early in a claims research? I'm not saying, let's just suspend reality for a minute. We're not talking about them playing a role in the assessment of a claim. But what role, if any, could they have early in a claims development? Canada's research assistant. As a research assistant?
I only say assistant only to assist a file because they have files that we don't have access to, that they have access to. So they can go look it up, as Daryl was saying.
So assist in the gathering?
Yeah, gathering of information.
and at the same time, consistency, right? They're public servants of Canada, so you do need them at the table at the outset, rather than trying to look at, we got 6 different negotiators now, that they should be groomed into the community, that they sit on that file, not just because of seniority, that you have to be placed elsewhere in territories or wherever,
Yeah.
because you get knocked off by somebody else and then you take a file elsewhere. It prolongs that whole process.
Well, let me ask the flip side of that. The flip side is capacity within the community.
So
How do you meet that need?
0 capacity. because you don't have that background, right? Because we as staff can't, and council, we're in that. So you have that corporate memory, but as individual staff, I came along 5 years, and then there's previous 20 years back chiefs that took the mandate of pushing that claim forward. And it's all based on whole oral history or what limited documents you have as far as letter writing and exchange of information. But that specific research, it's lacking.
Is funding a barrier to be able to sustain
Yes,
capacity?
because you get a budget of 100,000. That goes 3/4 of it to legal, and then that actual research that we need to do, whether as a community, let's say the Peggy Martin McGuire's or the Jillian Cress, those researchers, to access them and help us gather that information, put in, and then have those discussions, and then put the claim forward, rather than piecemeal, that you're only limited to these confines, 80/20, then you're like,
I find there
we
should
can't go
also-
forward, or can we go forward?
There should also be a push to put not so much the lands officer or land officer in each community, but there should be a central spot. Like I'm in lands right now, and I'm slowly developing an archive. Like anything that I can get my hands on that had Bayfield, Afton, Buckengate, whatever you want to call it, you have a copy of it, I want a copy of it.
Or 6 different names given to us.
So that we have that information there, and I'm slowly building an archive. So there needs to be, I know not everybody's into history like I am,
But it's important.
but it is very important.
And so this last budget cycle, federally, Specific Claims Branch restored some of the funding, research funding, available to levels that were prior to their legacy years for the next 5 years, that they've bumped up some of the research dollars. What happens after 5 years is to be determined. But in being able to look at this through the lens of doing something differently and saying to an independent process, here's what we need at the community level to facilitate real access. Archiving access to documentation, sustaining it, we've talked about. But what do you do at the staff level? Are you going year by year in terms of resources?
I'm a hoarder of information.
No, in terms of capacity, funding for the positions that people have. Like, is it year by year, or are you able to do multi-year planning?
For some, but we just went into 10 years.
It's a standalone item.
Yeah. For us,
It varies.
varies, yeah, for us it varies. But I also want to highlight where specific claims for us, I mean, like we have the terminology Aboriginal right and title, which Daryl touches on, and then we have what I kind of had our negotiator pause was he was comparing us to communities with TLE. We're not a TLE treaty. We're, you know, it doesn't
Unceded territory.
unceded territory. So it's when we looked at the work plan that was passed down to us, it's like it didn't reflect what we had in terms of treaty, I guess, treaty right in our work plan and how we're going to like it. TLEs I find are getting more to claims right now, like out in the West Coast. All of them are kind of getting through with their TLEs. What is their strength that we can share from them? What is it that they have that we can maybe utilize here in Atlantic? Because they seem to have a lot, because we have our treaty as well. So what is it that they're utilizing that we can use, what we could maximize here in Atlantic for us to help us with our spec claim process?
And what is it about an independent process that could assist to do that?
Continuity. Accountability. For sure. Ownership.
There doesn't seem to be place where, outside of like, say, the National Claims Research gathering that happens annually, there doesn't seem to be a place where First Nations can actually do that thinking or an analysis of what makes this claim successful in its resolution and the struggle carry on.
It's a huge gap there. That's hindering processes.
And that's touching on where a claims research is developed, where it's negotiated and potentially resolved, and then the resources that go along, like that cuts across all levels of what we're talking about. Yeah. Yeah. So you're thinking about using the tribunal, or potentially? Potentially.
Where we're steering, we may not have to, but we're prepared to.
The tribunal has also a mediation mandate. It can provide mediation services. I don't know, has anybody ever used that service?
Not yet.
Not yet.
No.
We might, I don't want to give the specifics, but where a negotiator has come up with a number, right? And then after a review, because of inconsistency, you got another negotiator coming through reviewing that claim, and then they may undermine what's there. We could get less. So that's the challenge that we are faced with, right? And to reopen that file and then hamper on that other smaller file, you get less monetary compensation. That could be the impact. And so that probably mediation could.
By the time we finish doing all that, we're not going to have no claim. It's all going to be used.
It's going to be worth nothing.
It's not going to be worth nothing because
300,000 is not going to be.
Because the amount of your loan funding exceeds the value of the claim?
Exceeds the value of our claim.
Because you've been at it so long. Because
That's where our chief was kind of thinking, like, okay, like, that's how we're kind of doing, when we do our evaluation on, say, the budgets where we're at. Okay, now we're thinking, okay, well, if that value is not going to be, any value to us, now we're looking at, okay, for the province of Nova Scotia, and in the negotiation process, is there room for us for loss of land, replaced land?
Right.
Going through a replaced land process. So if it's like so many 300 or 400 acres, what we're trying to find out is that can we utilize 300 or 400 acres here in Atlantic Canada, or is it just the province of Nova Scotia through the federal, the federal lands system?
additions to reserve?
Well, there's like lands in Nova Scotia, federal lands that we could utilize in exchange of the compensation
Oh,
money.
I see, yep.
So if we have, 240 acres that we're trying to get monetary value on, but like we're saying, once we do our budgets up and look at the work plans and how much we spent for the appraiser, the lawyer, all the possible mediation, our claim, we're not going to have anything to claim. So that's why we're thinking, well, why don't we think about land for land?
The current policy is just too rigid, it doesn't even include land, but
Yeah.
at the end of the day, you're going through another policy to add lands back to
Yeah.
it. So why can't we open that up and put land on the table?
Yeah.
Like a good example would be that Franklin Manor, right? You got two bands, Pictou Landing and Buckingham, where you have to have two full, what do you call that referendum? On and off reserve and 50+1 to that example. Can you get additional compensation for those types of lands elsewhere, right? If it could be had, or do you just divide the two?
But what you're describing is concerning on a number of levels. But the first is you're having to find, you're trying to find solutions to a problem where Canada has admitted there's a lawful obligation. So there is a remedy that's required. But you've been at the process so long, you've described 6 federal negotiators leaving, coming and going from the file. you're exhausting the resources to be able to continue to participate. And so in the calculus as to going or not, you're trying to find solutions that answer a problem that in 2008, Canada said it was prepared to negotiate. And no one outside of the community and CERNA through Spec Claims Branch knows really the problem. So in terms of transparency, it's yours alone. There's no public reporting of the challenge. This is, in many ways, it's the challenge that speaks to why every question is in these materials.
Yeah. And it's only to that specific valuation.
And you're talking about one claim.
Valuation of that land only.
Yeah.
And it brings back to that economic loss, right? On that land that was taken away, there was a mill. There's economic benefits, there was farmland.
Yeah,
All that is not
farmland.
part of that because of just the way it's confined. in the
What they
60s.
want to quantify as a loss.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So in a different world, and I know it's frustrating because we're talking about the world you're in, and then this one we're trying to design, which, you know, by the time we get there, will it have shaped the outcome? I would hope not. I would hope that you would get to the solution because this has a long way to go. But what the problems we want it to address are the very challenges that you're working through. Objective criteria is a really good example, where in being able to negotiate a resolution, where would a third party who has no vested interest in the what's quantified as a loss, who the expert is, the funding that puts you there, they're there with a specialized expertise as the independent process. And when you talk about the objective criteria that you search out through appraisers to be able to find a number that more reflects your methodology so that you can actually have a conversation with Canada's expert and their formula so that it's a more level playing field, that's what we're talking about. It's putting that process in place so as to what is the role of an independent body. That's what we're asking. You know, when you look at the real day-to-day frustrations of just being one-on-one with SCB, how would a third-party neutral help? Put them in the room. Now, what do we want them to do? And it's that. It's being able to police behavior. I mean, some of this is about just being able to police behavior. And this is what we've heard in other sessions. The conduct of the parties is a real factor. Coming to the table with a mandate, the scope of that mandate, how creative are they? These are all the elements to this that we're looking at.
Yeah, that'll be the biggest positive, is getting the definition of the mandate rather than at the end, you're seeking mandate after AIP or an agreement in principle that limits you to that, towards that final agreement, right?
Mm-hmm.
And once you've reached AIP, you're stuck within those confines, whether you go forward or not. And having that mandate at the outset would be far more greater, where you have guiding principles that could be outlined. Like what Rose said, we're not TLE, but there are principles that were outlined in the TLE process. You have your reciprocity, you've got your transparency, you've got respect, you've got all those 11, I think it was 11 that the Treaty Commissioner out west defined under the TLE process, where it's what's needed here as well, is that understanding of that whole process of the it's not dismantled, but it's still their Office of Tree Commissioner. And at that time, that was to alleviate the 11 or 12 tables that were happening across Canada, and then Mishka and a few others that went through that whole process. Now you've got independent processes across Canada specific to their tree areas or their land areas.
Yeah.
But we've delved away from those guiding principles to help with diverting from the, I don't want to say the dirty word, Canada's, that whole process where it's confined, where you're domesticating the processes, where as the treaty, it's more of defining the oral perspective versus the written text. Then you have here those oral histories, but we can't address those long line outstanding issues because of certificate of title was all encompassing of all the population, right? Then you throw in those reserve creation, and then you've separated the communities who's entitled to what because of those relocation and reserve creations that hamper on what are you really entitled to as a community.
Have you ever had, or would you be interested in ever Canada or representatives being in the community?
I think that would be a good starting point just to get perspective, like Chief PJ is not here, but he's
PJ
been
Prosper?
experienced in that whole process and other processes. He'd be more the legal guru, I guess, for the community.
But also being able to meet with them on your territory gives
Yeah.
you the boost that you need to make sure that you get your point across as to how important that this matter is.
Do they ever come?
We have some that come on a regular basis. And I mean, I'd call them friends, like they're
Yeah,
come close over the
We've-
years.
we've taken some, our community's taken, our counselors stepped out, but we've taken some pretty bold steps.
That's
We
positive.
had to, and we continue to. But it's really bringing Canada to our territory, which our negotiator is now, and took them right to the land, took them right where our severed lands are. Like, you stand here and watch this every day, you know? You walk it. And we've done it nationally. We brought them down also from Ottawa, you know, and we told them, you did this to us. Now you have to fix this. You know, showing them the actual deeds from the Indian agents, you know, and they're learning the process, like as they're analyzing those documents. It's painful. And I'm sure the past leaders now and the ones that are, you know, gone, I'm sure they're wanting us to continue taking that bold action. But it's, when we're taking that, also we need to build that capacity. I guess the big thing that we require now is building that capacity in our community. But not as just building capacity in our community, it's also building that learning curve for Canada. And bringing them the, what do you call that? Almost like a cultural shock or awareness or training to, can't compare us, even, like, we all have one thing in common across this country, it's the Indian Act. And, but each community is so different. Like, can't compare, you can't compare Buckingham to Shubenacadie or Millbrook or anybody. Like, our struggles are surreal, however different as well. So our needs are different, our capacities are different, our land bases are different, our governance systems within our own communities are all different. We've got structures and different roles and responsibilities. But,
So systems we create have to respect that flexibility and
Yes.
diversity.
yeah,
It's not a one-size-fits-all.
And at the same time, you've got other processes where we could learn from the West
Yeah.
is negotiators being immersed into the communities. The communities take them out on the land, like understanding the world views. It's not just oral history, there's a world view that stipulates, yes, there's a respect. We've got 7 guiding principles under the Mi'kmaq view that helps with moving forward rather than the confines of the 80-20 formula. There is more to that than just land, right? So having access, that where is your territory as far as a people and its survival for the next generations, right? It's not just the confines of the reserve. It's that whole area. Where can you fish? Where can you hunt? Like it's becoming limited because the Crown lands got limited access. That's why the KMK&O process is ideal
Yeah,
for access right now. But what happens when it's severed
yeah.
or when lands are brought out by private owners? What happens then if we don't not tackle, but help address and have another process where it could marry the two? And here's a solution. This is what communities can do. Not just access, but how could we give First Nations that land because of limited land base, right?
Are there any particular points you would make because of all of the uniqueness that you've just described? Is there a particular message that you would want to ensure gets conveyed, so as there's no more harm introduced or risk introduced? Like, don't make certain assumptions. And I say that because I recognize, and I so thank you, Daryl, for pointing out this Made in Nova Scotia process, which I was not aware as a tripartite forum. So I pulled it up at the lunch hour, and I'll read more closely the website materials. But are there any specific messages that you would want to convey in terms of not crossing lines or?
Well, the assumptions would be New Brunswick takes a different approach, right? Where if the Mi'kmaq had taken a collective approach, not divided by province, but that's out of our control, right? So each province does that. So New Brunswick is unique in that sense that they can go for title. But whereas research, you're divvying up those provincial boundaries and limiting the scope of what a Unamagi or that collective confederacy looks like, right? As a collective. Because that could hamper divide and conquer approach is what I'm getting at is then you're limited to Nova Scotia and other elements of that. Then what is it? Is it that process of allocation? Okay, then let's go a step further and say, yes, we can allocate these lands, but how does it look under whatever it is, an ATR process or reserve creation, collective? What is that access to those resources that help with ongoing discussions, right? Because you don't want to assume that we're going for title. I don't think that's the whole intent of the KMK&O process. It's more of reconciliation. What is that interpretation based on oral history to move forward and have an agreed upon process where communities also need to know and be aware of that whole process because it's that disconnect, right? It took me this long to understand that whole process which you had outlined, where there is good things happening, but monetary, it's not beneficial immediately, but there are processes happening now that economic benefits could happen in the near future.
such
Like
as
windmill.
such as the predesignation that's happening in the
predesignations as
West
well.
Coast. I know Chief PJ and I sat a couple national roundtables, and we've brought that up numerous times because going through the processes of designation through the Indian Act, we've done it. We've done our votes and whatnot, but for us to be, if we're trying to move massive projects through. It really hinders our processes of, you know, we're trying to get businesses and gotta go through this and the designation process, but here we are with fee simple properties. We've got properties that are in spec claims that we've bought back. But why can't we look at a process that help us get into that pre-designation status while we're doing this? Because it's, I mean, like, it has a lot of impact
Yeah.
on,
Like what that KMU process is doing, right?
Yeah.
You've got lands there, you negotiate with the province.
Yeah,
Why not start giving those lands to the First Nations,
yeah.
whether Canada pays for it, and then bands start buying out or allocated?
And how could an independent body be more facilitative? Is what you're consistently describing, Rose, is solutions that are far more comprehensive in their scope than just single doorway. Because you can go through this door of acquiring land, and you have a larger vision as to what that's going to achieve or what you want to use them for. But you need it, currently, you need all of these other processes of Canada to cooperate, and they're not cooperating in a way that's cohesive. You're doing it because that's the way their process is designed. And so if this is about, let's talk about this in terms of claims resolution, because you're looking at this through that lens, there's a much more holistic, potentially, role for an independent process to play in making sure all of those parts are actually working in tandem. So when you make a selection of land, it's informed by a community vision that is about, let's say it's acquiring for commercial purposes, but at the time that you're doing that, you have all of the right other pieces in place, so when you pre-designate it and the opportunity comes along to maximize whatever use you want to make, you don't have to go backwards to then get the ratification from the community, because the speed of business isn't going to keep pace with that.
that's right.
And it costs a lot of money to go back that way. To take a community through its ratification process is a costly process.
Yes, it is.
So at the time that you're making the land selection and you're identifying uses, that's the time to be able to say, and we'll designate it for what X, Y, and Z. And you actually have Canada as a partner trying to find the solution to that. Yeah.
And then through those learnings, we found out that there's a provincial issue that through that designation, transfer of lands, right? Where Canada, you could transfer lands, and it was, whether it's through highway or waterways or whatnot, that once it's a simple statement under Canada's rule, transfer of land from province to feds, then feds to First Nation. Or vice versa, right? It's a lot, like you say, it's costly going vice versa. But when you're going from province to feds and then feds to First Nation, that should be looked at as an ideal or a good process through pre-designation. Right? That helped with that whole process, and you didn't have to deal with, okay, so-and-so DOJ of the province can't do this, but through that process of land transfers, it made things a lot quicker, faster, and less monetary on all parties. Right? That's a form that should be looked at more often than so, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, so we're pretty bold.
I'm glad. Lessons learned. You could write your own best practices manual. I'm going to make sure that.
I think our community too, I think this is good to have, but really, all of us around this table, we're aging.
Yes.
And I think
Me too.
my concern is that we're doing all of these things and we're learning and we're not transferring our knowledge to where it should go. Like, you know, bringing it back to the community and developing that knowledge and knowledge transfer just to the community level, because when they look at us, spec claims is way up here, and we're talking down. So we have to align what we're doing with the community in terms of having them understand. We've done that, like our chief and council and our staff, like when we really started getting into the lands piece, like, you know, the designation, the surrender, the now land use plan, and they're engaged. But they're still saying, communities, like, we don't know what specific claims means. Like, you know, we don't know how much we lost and how much we're gonna gain. They should be all involved. It should be, AFN should be helping us develop some kind of a workshop. This is great, the technicians and all the senior staff are here, but we need to transfer that and bring those sessions to community to have that engagement and that communication from them, because really they're the knowledge keepers. We've got elders in the community that could probably emphasize and share way more than what we even know. They've lived through watching their land severed, you know, and it'd be nice if we could kind of start doing something a little bit more, I don't like using the words grassroots. I mean, how is that, just bringing it to the people, bringing this, what we're doing
Well,
to
in
the
order
people?
to have an informed decision, when you're asking them to vote, they need to be
Yeah,
educated.
we can't do it last minute. We tend to not ever do it like that.
Yeah. Well, and it takes a lot of resources, like that's a lot of resources to continue to,
But if we're going to be transparent and accountable
yeah,
ourselves, like we're asking Canada to be, we need to be like,
yeah.
do the exact same for our own people, so.
At the session following the National Research Conference that the claims researchers had in Six Nations, they talked about a pilot project being undertaken by the National Archives on gathering oral history within communities. Do you remember that, Paula? Were you a part of that?
Not at the Six Nations one.
So there is a current effort underway where Archives Canada is collaborating with willing communities to gather oral history.
Write that down.
Yeah, so Jody Woods, the director at UBCIC, who was part of Artist's video, she'll have all of the information on what the project actually is. But why I mention it is because there have been in sessions talks about strategic partnerships and being able to maximize other institutions like that, as well as universities and
I
colleges.
was just going to say St. FX has, come forward to collect, archives. Who was working with us last time? CMM pretty much does it all, eh? APC?
More CMM. But I'm all for that, but my thing is also, they're gathering our information, it's ours.
Yes,
It doesn't sit on a bottom shelf in room 2006,
yeah,
row 12. That's not their information, that's our information.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. And the point was made in other sessions that this was about students that were within the community and whom were in post-secondary institutions. And it was part of their education curriculum.
We have a little something. Like
And it
that.
serves multiple purposes, right? Like you're working with students that are within your own community that might be at colleges and universities. They're needing certain research credits. So there was a bit of symmetry of need. This wasn't about information leaving, I guess was the larger point. Research wasn't leaving the community as a proprietariness outside.
Gathered
It was an
education.
investment being made because the students were from the communities that were giving these examples.
So is there any communities now Canada-wide that are going through the independent process?
No, we haven't created it. This is why, this is like trying to create a better world
Okay,
while
so
we're
there's
in,
there's not even a pilot or,
while we're in the, but if you would recommend one, if you would recommend a pilot, Rose?
I would, yeah.
Is this similar to what the now Justice Sinclair went through in the specific claims when, back in the early 80s? Is that the similar process of discussion and information gathering?
Justice Sinclair, I'm not sure.
Not
Not
from
TRC.
TRC, the other, I think he's a judge now.
Justice Slade, who's at the tribunal?
Harry Slade?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's at the tribunal.
Always
Oh, he's at tribunal.
Yeah, Justice Slade from BC. Yeah, he's at the tribunal. But if we recommend a pilot, what would you recommend? And I'll write it down. A pilot out here.
Well, similar to what we went through, that was a great process where you found out through pre-designation, things can be fast-tracked just through that acknowledgement and understanding to get to the end result because of a highway lands being given, but that model fast-tracked a lot of process under reserve lands, but
Yeah.
outside the scope, it's
We
more
developed,
challenging.
we developed our own tripartite agreement between Buckinghamshire, the feds, and the province.
Mm.
And then you have that communication, right? So then they communicate directly with NRCan and all the other players
Mhm.
that help fast track it. It wasn't a matter of just tweeting the minister,
Mm-hmm.
but it was those departmental heads where you have public servants who could make things move a lot quicker and faster.
And so-
rather than
What was the community?
to lead up for the
Bucking
order of
Gate.
council.
PNQ, TNKK.
So if there was such a forum where you wouldn't have to recreate the wheel every time, you would model it on that experience.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That, and we've developed our own MOUs between the province when it came to, Emery was probably part of that process, I can't remember, but, it was almost like an orientation kit, like it was an MOU between Buckingham and the province that in an event there was change in government on either side, that the priorities of what we were doing for our land use or our negotiations were going to stay on priority list.
And putting aside those legal issues, right?
Yeah,
That we were like blind to it. Let's just move forward and
So trying to, you used a method to protect and preserve the path you were on in the face of political volatility
yes,
on either side.
on other side, yeah.
And
And particularly for our case, it was provincial in Indian government, or whatever you call that, in the elections. So it was the agreement between both leaders, both governments. MOU was made,
it
and it
survives.
survived.
These are really interesting ideas in claims resolution, like
Yeah.
what are the factors that you need to stay? You need stability, you need consistency of representation, like all of the factors that go into it. You chose to use the tool of an MOU, but all of that are elements, building blocks.
Yeah.
The one thing that is really unique, I have to say here, is that you have this Made in Nova Scotia process. You have a really unique forum. I'm not saying I'm replacing one with the other. I just think it's a really unique tripartite process. Doesn't exist elsewhere.
No.
And where other tripartite processes have existed, they haven't survived in other territories, in Ontario in particular.
Yeah, so we've actually have two of those processes. We have the Made in Nova Scotia process under Kane Pano, Then we have our tripartite, Nova Scotia tripartite forum. But those are like numerous tables there, but one table there is economic development lands.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But KMK no would be more based on the political lands.
Why do you call it KK and O?
KMK no,
It's Mi'kmaq.
it's Mi'kmaq, don't ask me to say it.
Oh, okay. It's short form for a
Yeah.
Mi'kmaq term.
It's an
Well,
acronym.
what's the acronym though? KI?
KMKNO.
KMKNO.
People like them, love them, hate them, so.
Okay. I want to make sure you've had a chance to tell me
Negotiating
everything that
office
you
is the
want to
last one I
say.
know. No,
APC, Atlantic Policy Congress too has a lot of research that I don't feel is shared to us when we could be utilizing their research on how we, they have a lot of economic research, land research. I think that, I know it's there for the public to see, but I think we've got to research that and see how maybe that can be utilized somehow in our spec claim.
Mhm.
Our tribal councils as well. For us in general, it would be the Confederacy of Mainland Micmacs.
Mhm.
Paula, I've been sending her there. She's grabbing a lot of her archives. That's helping us with our development of our land code.
Mhm.
Which in general, you found a lot of stuff in terms of spec claim as well. So,
Do you know how many spec claims there are coming from the Maritimes? Pauline, do you know?
I don't have a really good idea. I know that, like, right now, we're sitting at over 500 claims. in the
Nationally.
inventory. Yeah. And if I had to just take a guess, I would say that from all the Atlantic provinces, it's probably less than 50.
and I guess my question to you is how many
Have settled.
have been successful in the last, I'm just curious to know what happened in the last 5 years
Mhm.
in terms of any communities actually
Settling.
settling.
I'll get that for you, Rose.
I think Red Bank,
I know of a
Gotta
couple,
get
not in
that.
Atlantic, but nationally, I know of
I
a
think
couple.
Red Bank after 81 years finally settled.
I could find this out fairly quickly.
Okay.
It'd be nice to know, because
Yeah.
it'd
Can
be
you,
great,
Pauline?
it'd be good for us to know which communities did actually in our neighbors settled in, how
Yeah.
did they do it?
Yeah.
You know, those best practices for us are really useful. We've utilized other communities in New Brunswick to, like, when we did our designation, like, we seen their do's and don'ts,
Yeah.
and we really developed our own our communication toolkit around how we were going to address and work with community when it come to land issues or land decisions.
So could an independent process participate with that
I
in
think so.
a pilot?
In a pilot. Maybe I'm thinking too deep.
There's a big claim that's being settled right now. Is it the Sambo claim or?
Sambro Lake.
Sambo, that's the one,
That's,
eh?
That's the one we're talking about.
that's what we're talking about, Shubenacadie and Millbrook. But even that's vague, like, you know, and I really I support what Daryl said, it should have been a Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq claim. Because it was
Collective territory,
collective territory.
not just two First Nations.
like when you look at that title to script, it's a collective, right?
Yep.
It was huge. And they got dwindled, farmlands, encroachment, and it got pushed further.
I don't think it's gonna pass. I think other people, other bands are starting to speak up against it, so, I mean,
Mhm.
like for our designation, it was our jurisdictional area, I guess,
Mhm.
that's our area, so when
Mhm.
we can put claim to that, but
Mhm.
for that one,
Mhm.
Halifax, I think that should have been all our bands.
Pauline, can you find out that number?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
I'd be interested for our council to go sit down with Red Bank Council and, you know, talk about how they work through their spec
Yeah.
claim.
Yeah.
We had a great negotiator, but now he's the judge, isn't he? The tribunal judge, Paul.
Oh, Paul Fable.
Fable.
Yes,
Yeah.
federal court.
Yeah, federal court. So he was great to start out with now, but now we have a negotiator that's been committed to stay with us right to the end. So hopefully, we just gave him a little poke this morning just to give an update. You know, since August, council, you guys never got no update on spec claims lately, eh? So just that process of communication to the leadership
Yeah,
is important.
Yeah.
because
absolutely.
they're the decision makers at the end.
Do you have any final thoughts? Messages that you absolutely must convey?
Settle us.
Settle us. That's a message for Pauline to take back to headquarters. I should say as well, make known that the AFN has also been receiving written submissions for any thinking that happens, people after we leave and, you know, wanted to convey a message that they overlooked, or who weren't able to actually participate in person, but still want to deliver their remarks. So Aaron Asselstein, who isn't here, who's also a policy advisor with the AFN, it's his email. And so his email is on this written submission, request for written submission. That's his inbox.
So just on current reserves, like just talking specifically, right? So part of capital, when we're looking at land allotments for subdivisions or housing, right? Just that whole trend where a majority of reserves were created where land was no good. So
Right.
you have these plots of land, but you can't develop them based on that factor, right?
The quality.
Yeah, so you have to go elsewhere, that's why,
In Nova Scotia, we're in swamps.
yeah. And then you're giving those allotments, it's not serviceable, but you wanna make it serviceable, then you're gonna spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in some places, until you have to pay for an appraiser to say, okay, this is not serviceable lot. But just the way serviceable lot, because you're gonna have to spend close to $100,000 just to make it
Serviceable.
Serviceable.
Out of the First Nations resources.
So those types of factors should all be looked at as well. The reserves that were given, it's not prime, or it's not good land to expand your population or homes at, right? So you could find an overcrowding in those little parcels of land. Like what I'm alluding to was that 1 acre per household stipulation, that's under treaty, but there are the processes where you could look at how you could compensate a growing population steady, not a huge influx like other bands, right? You range from 400 to 6,000, and that's unique, right? And eventually, I think the population will grow, but your land base is not good.
Of the existing reserve.
Of existing reserves.
The chief Pierrot negotiated, that was a planned claim, right? Or was that addition to,
Those addition to reserve.
was addition to reserve?
Then just thinking out loud on access to information on oral history, yeah, I think it should be housed somewhere in institutions, because when I did my research, I had to fight for my own oral history to be put against a university's own code ethics, research ethics, where UNDRIP and a few others, the United Nations, have those guiding research ethics and principles that the Mi'kmaq developed here in Nova Scotia as well. So I had to, under the demise of the Mi'kmaq protocols, to do my research here in Nova Scotia. And now that's that's becoming a trend, right? I mean, where access to your own oral history and using them. Because the other question would be, if it's gonna be used at admissible in court cases, is that the confines of how we're to get that information out there? That's the whole other kettle of fish.
It is. It raises some really interesting questions. Some of which, I don't know if you're familiar with the recent decision in Robinson Huron challenged the Robinson Huron treaty terms and challenged Canada and Ontario. And they were successful. Ontario's appealing the decision, which will be heard sometime next spring. But I raise it here because it's a really interesting case for how watershed it was for the introduction of the protocols informed treaty making and what they thought, and brought all of that evidence into the court's proceedings. They followed the Federal Court of Canada's new guidelines as to accepting expert evidence. And they're really forward-looking in terms of being able to respond, not as a one size, but to what the community's needs are. The challenge becomes, and I think this is where there's a lot more thinking to be done here, but Restoule is a really good example of a judge, Justice Hennessy, whom went into all of the protocols that were designed, the sweats, the pipe ceremony. They brought the pipe into the courthouse. There was a lot of ceremony that went alongside the trial proceeding itself. And what's interesting about that is, as a real decision, case, that's all in the record. What's interesting about that in this context is, how would that experience shape a spec claims process? And are there lessons there? And what questions come in putting those principles, and this point was made very clear, and it's in the decision itself. She wasn't being asked to make any judgments on their protocol. They were bringing the protocol into the courthouse to inform the court. She wasn't being asked to make any decisions about it. And that's pretty fundamental. If you're going to introduce that into ceremony, into the proceedings, it's not for the purposes of making a judgment on those protocols. They are what they are. But they were to inform how the Robinson Huron came into treaty. And it's the first I'm aware of in Ontario that such an approach has been taken. And there's a part of the decision where she actually asks, you're not asking me to make any decisions about this, and they're very clear in saying no, that this is about informing the court as fact. These are facts about how we came into treaty. But it raises all of the questions around, how do you do that, or could you do that within another process, in an adjudicative process? Actually, you know what? The proceedings themselves went on for 8 months. Yep. And it was the first time a court in Ontario webcast.
Yeah.
And they webcast the whole of the proceedings so that the First Nations could view it. They couldn't all be in Sudbury at the courthouse, but they could be a part of it. They could watch every day.
Wow. Is there a link that we could share with our chief?
There is.
He's huge on their research, stuff like that.
There is a link. I'll find it and send it along. It's really quite compelling. And they brought all of their elders, some of their elders into the courthouse. So did I say they actually brought the pipe?
So how is the United Nations Declaration of Rights?
How does it shape this?
Yeah.
Article 47 is the article that we reference, or sorry, 27. It's the article that we reference in the very first page of the topics for discussion.
Okay.
We cite it. But it's the article whereby states shall establish and implement in conjunction with Indigenous peoples. So this is about being able to jointly create versus unilaterally create. A fair, independent, impartial, open, transparent process, which is all of the principles that shape the conversation we've been having through these engagements. Giving due recognition to Indigenous peoples' laws, traditions, customs, land tenure systems, to recognize and adjudicate the rights of Indigenous peoples pertaining to their lands, territories, and resources, including those which were traditionally owned or otherwise occupied. And Indigenous peoples shall have the right to participate. We cite the elements of that, Article 27, as being foundational to how we would view another process. And when Minister Bennett addressed the UN Assembly and committed Canada in its adoption, we were not cherry-picking articles. That speaks specifically to the claims processes. And so at the joint technical table, where we've been with specific claims branch, this is how we talk about these issues.
Oh, it's interesting, because I just asked Paula to pull up the article that I was reviewing a few days ago on the huge victory for BC, where they've actually used the
Yes,
United Nations Declaration as a change in legislation law.
yes, the province.
The whole
Yes.
province of BC.
Yes,
So that's where, like, when we talk about KMKNO, that's something that they should be
yes,
looking into.
yes.
But I mean,
Absolutely.
if it's something that we could utilize in our own processes that we're undertaking for SPECLEAN.
Mm-hmm. Because of all of the chronology, the timeline for every effort that's been made towards reform, when we list them all, one material change, in addition to all of the very meaningful, then we put it into practice.
Yeah. I agree.
Okay, well.
Okay, you could pray in your own religion or views, if you have any. Neil sine jo nihitil. Big magi nana jo esla asie bisne ki new bazo unade no skens kanaha. Da no tsi di asi bisne ku unade ha nit aha. Nade no skeno dat bikahitilu bisne ku no skenaha. Oh.
Thank you. Yes. Oh, the 30th, November 30th. And that just coincides with the last week of our sessions, that's all.